This time we look at 10 of the most expensive British classics. There have always been those bikes that are just that little bit out of reach, that bit too expensive. But let's imagine for a few moments that you've got, I don't know, a maid in art has died and she's left you a ton of money. So what do? What are your options? Here are 10 great options if you're really into classic British bikes and money is no object. The Ariel Square 4. Ah yes, this Square 4, a concept, it is said at least, was conceived on the back of a matchbox by Edward Turner in 1928. At least that's the legend. It's a good story and we'll stick to it. Whether it's true or not, who cares? Now Turner did peddle his concept design around to various companies, most of whom were not interested in the slightest. Ariel however were different, and they set him up with an office and a design staff to help prove the concept. And surprisingly, the first model is a very compact little bike. It's of only 500 cc's and fitted snugly into the frame previously used by a single cylinder 250. Early models of course were single overhead cam and the carburettor was fitted at the front of the engine. And Ariel did take a blown version of the 500 to Brooklands to try and set some speed records. This of course wasn't successful, largely so the story goes due to multiple head gasket failures. And therein lies one of the two Achilles heels of the design. It can run very hot for those back cylinders, and trying to make the thing breathe is not easy, with both inlet and exhaust tracks being suboptimal for really high performance breathing. But the machine was in perfect primary balance, so it provided a smooth, effective tourer, and so that is the direction that Ariel very much took the design, first enlarging it to 600 cc's, but then redesigning the engine completely with full crankshafts and overhead valves. And although cooling was improved, the engine still didn't breathe fantastically even in 1000cc form. Early thousands had one exhaust each side. Later ones are really noticeable by having twin exhausts on each side of the engine and of course aluminium head and barrels. These final versions make around 40 horsepower compared to 34 horsepower for the earlier models. But the machine was never intended as a performance mount. A good thing too, because it could be outperformed by much smaller engines. But they were less smooth and sophisticated. This was the ultimate gentleman's conveyance, although a rare beast and of course, as befits the video, very expensive. Vincent HRD. Now in the case of Vincent HRD, it really doesn't matter which model you choose, they're all going to be really expensive. But they're all beautifully engineered and they're all exquisitely designed. Whether it be a post-war single or V-twin, it's going to be expensive, whether it's a Black Shadow or one of the more touring-based bikes. But if money is absolutely no object, then settle for nothing else than a pre-war bike, like the Series A. This is a single-cylinder version, of course, that would later be developed into the Series A Rapide. Now those Series A Rapides are very functional in terms of design. Plumber's nightmare they're often called, and they look amazing. Perhaps the best looking of all Vincents, simply because they have that slightly chaotic look to all the plumbing. But has there ever been a more purposeful looking machine? Of course the Series A is not perfect. All that power and torque really overwhelm the gearbox for example. But it is rare and therefore extremely valuable and desirable. But of course there's the Black Shadow, the iconic Vincent. Highly collectible and highly desirable. And a big performer, let's not forget. But Phil Vincent had something more groundbreaking under his sleeve, and that of course was the Black Prince. A bike it seems that basically nobody wanted at the time, making it incredibly rare, and thus eye-wateringly expensive, if you can find one. The BSA Rocket 3. The Rocket 3 was BSA's take on the all-new 3-cylinder engine. It was basically a Triumph design, but the management decided they needed a BSA version of the engine too, which critically delayed the bike's introduction into full production. The R3 did go on sale in 1968, but this was only a few months before the arrival of the CB750 from Honda. Now, you can argue the pros and cons of the BSA's overhead valve engine, but it's probably the oval design and its unusual styling that most affected sales, especially in the all-important US market. Now, though they're very similar, the two engines are not exactly identical. They do share most of the same components, but the barrels on the BSA are actually leaned forward slightly. Some publications will tell you that the whole engine is tilted forward, but this is not correct. But the engine is very much of a Triumph design, right down to those dual camshafts and external pushrod tubes, although internally it's a little bit more mixed, because the bore and stroke is 67x70, the same as a BSA 250, and the crankshaft was now one-piece forging, replacing the earlier bolt-up design from the prototypes. As we moved into the 70s, BSA would restyle the design to fit more of American tastes, moving it away from those early oval designs, which to some extent did help to improve sales, but by this point the Honda had well and truly taken over the market. But BSA weren't done yet. They brought in a young American, Craig Vetter, who did a really nice design job to create the X75, which went down like a lead balloon with the guys at the factory, who completely failed to see the bike's design potential. But by that point BSA was pretty much going under, and when the bike did eventually appear, it would be badged as a Triumph. It was really a BSA Rocket 3 all along. But even then, the company continued to fail to appreciate the bike's potential, and just didn't promote the thing at all. It was a complete and utter sales failure, and therefore a desirable classic today. The Coventry Eagle Flying 8. Produced not surprisingly in Coventry, Coventry Eagle is best known for its small capacity bikes, but did produce a very nice range of rather more glamorous V-twins alongside them, although admittedly in tiny numbers. Although established earlier, the company began to use the Coventry Eagle name in 1897, and within a year was experimenting with engine kits to fit to their bicycles. During the 1920s, the company would produce motorcycles with engines from all kinds of suppliers, from Jap, Villiers, Blackburn, and even Matchless. This was a small company and was badly affected by the Depression. Their scaled-back motorcycle production concentrated mostly on bicycles, with the majority of their motorcycle production now being lightweights powered by Villiers engines. But they did produce their glamour models such as the Flying 8 in small numbers as well. This is roughly the equivalent of a Bru Superior of the period, offering similar levels of performance and glamour, but with that truly gorgeous black and red paint job. Like Bru Superior, Coventry Eagle did not survive after World War II. Consequently, their machines are rare and extremely collectible today. The Velocet Venom. The Venom was the last of the line to make use of the high-cam Velocet engine. The Venom was introduced in 1955 alongside its 350cc Viper stablemate. Both were based off more humble, basic touring models, with the Venom being based off the 500cc MSS, but fitted with a high compression piston and an aluminium barrel, albeit with a cast iron liner. And this and other tuning mods would raise peak power to 34 horsepower at 6,200 RPM, enough for a top speed of around 100 miles an hour. And the chassis was very good, despite being of simple brazed lug construction. And of course there's that neat Velocet rear suspension adjustment system too. Clearly this was a bike designed to go head to head with BSA's Gold Star model, and certainly in the early days it wasn't quite as successful, but Gold Star production would end in 1962 and the Velocet would go on for several more years. Consequently there are quite a lot of the Venoms around, relatively speaking, so the standard Venom will often be slightly less expensive than a Gold Star, but only slightly. But if you're determined to empty your pockets that little bit quicker, there's always the odd rarity such as the Scrambler. But if you really want a sporty road racing overhead valve Velocet, then the Fruxton is the only bike for you. The Norton Inter. For some, the Inter is the ultimate race replica. Originally introduced as the CS1 in 1927 and designed by Walter Moore, this was Norton's first overhead cam racer. But after a major redesign of the works bikes in the early 30s, the bike went on to become a fast road bike. And this then is the TT replica or the International. The bike could be ordered during the 1930s with all manner of mods that would allow you to use it as a road racer. And the bike would go on to have an amazingly long production run, lasting all the way until 1958, despite being by that time very outdated and somewhat underpowered. But the long production run does not mean it was built in great numbers, and year-on-year production numbers were very modest. As a consequence, these bikes are very rare and very desirable, especially the post-1950 bikes with their featherbed frames, and with many of these bikes being raced until they drop to pieces, or having their frames stolen to create tridents, the numbers that have survived are consequently very low. So if you want the race replica, you best dig deep. The BSA Gold Star. Designed by Val Page, the BSA Gold Star was introduced in 1938 and was a development of the earlier Empire Star. The first model was a 500cc M24. This ran an aluminium head and barrel and was perhaps one of the most beautiful bikes that BSA ever created. Now, of course, the interruption of World War II means that the bike was only produced for a short while before the war actually started, so numbers are low and thus a high degree of desirability for these early machines. And the post-war bikes, which finally appeared in 1948, initially as a 350 with the 500 starting later, are a very different design. And though it's often forgotten, it's the 350 that actually carried most of the early success in terms of competition. The 500 would take a couple of more seasons to finally hit its winning ways, but when it did, it was unbeatable. In fact, so much so that it would kill off clubman racing in the UK, the grid being occupied almost exclusively by Gold Stars. Now, the Gold Star is very much like many of the machines here. In other words, it's the very early and very late models that are the most desirable. But the DBD series is very much the pinnacle of development for these particular machines. It's not hard to see why the Gold Star is so popular, achingly beautiful, and of course with proven race success. But it's interesting to note that its prices aren't quite as high as the RGS model these days, although I seem to remember them being much more evenly matched in the past. Now, this may be for a couple of reasons. One, of course, the average classic bike rider is, let's face it, getting a bit older, so starting the things isn't exactly easy. And of course they're not the most practical bikes given the nature of modern traffic. The RGS is that little bit easier when it comes to riding through modern traffic. So will we see Gold Star prices falling through the floor? I shouldn't hold my breath if I was you. The Triumph Bonneville T120. Now, in case you're wondering, the T in T120 stands for Tiger, and Tiger was the sporting models in Edward Turner's Triumph range from the 1930s onward. The first parallel twin Tiger was the Tiger 100 of 1939, and indeed this model would reappear post-war but would soon be supplemented by the 650cc Tiger 110. The 110 was of course based off the earlier Thunderbird but had an aluminium barrel but just a single carburettor. Now, Turner viewed these models as sports tourers rather than competition bikes, hence the slightly conservative styling, and this would be applied to the first T120 when it made its bow in 1959. However, the all-important American market weren't keen on the rather staid styling, so in 1960 they gave the bike a thorough restyling job to create the iconic look of the first pre-unit Bonnevilles. And for some, these pre-unit machines are the most beautiful and the most desirable of all Bonnevilles, but they're not necessarily the most capable. The machine would gradually develop, especially in terms of its chassis, throughout the 1960s, with unit construction arriving to the engine in 1963. But it's perhaps the iconic 1968 model year which is the most sought after of the unit construction machines, because this is the point at which the engine, chassis and styling all came together to make a truly perfect Triumph. Or so say the aficionados at least. Bru Superior. The story of Bru Superior starts when George Bru left Bru Motorcycles and created Bru Superior, which, as you can imagine, pleased his father no end. His father, of course, being Mr. Bru, the owner of Bru Motorcycles, who laughingly joked that his bikes were now probably called Bru Inferior. Now, you don't need me to tell you that Bru Superiors go for insane money at auction. But here's the strange thing. In their day, Bru Superiors are not as expensive as you might think. Because while we all talk about the SS100, the SS80 with its side valve engine was by far Bru Superior's most popular machine, and was in fact not as pricey as you might think in its time, with the equivalent model from Royal Enfield actually costing more money. But Bru produced high quality machines, but he produced them in tiny numbers. But George Bru was a sharp businessman, and he understood the importance of publicity. He created unusual one-offs, different ranges of machines just for sidecar use for example, engineering pieces of excellence like the Golden Dream, which while only ever built in tiny numbers, was great publicity for the brand. And thus did George create a motorcycling icon. And the fact the company didn't survive the war only serves to greatly intensify their mystique. And so while it isn't always the case, in this case, rarity brings extreme value. And so for most of us, the ownership of a Bru Superior is only ever going to be a dream. The BSA Rocket Gold Star. The BSA Rocket Gold Star, or RGS, represents a swan song for the venerable A10 range of motorcycles. Now the RGS can ostensibly be seen as a sort of part spin special, using a Super Rocket engine in a Gold Star frame, although in truth the Gold Star frame was modified for use on the RGS. The engine was a post-61 Super Rocket motor with a 9:1 compression ratio and a 357 sports camshaft, which, despite the use of just a single carburettor, an AMAL carburettor was spec'd as standard for road versions, gave just 46 horsepower, with 50 horsepower available if mods such as a GP2 carburettor were fitted. And there were lots of modification options available: clip-on bars, close ratio gearbox, whatever the rider chose. The machine makes use of a Siamese exhaust, which goes into a Gold Star silencer, giving the bike a distinctive sound unlike any of the earlier A10s. The styling of the RGS is of course exactly the same as that of the Gold Star, so truly beautiful. One of Britain's most iconically beautiful motorcycles, I believe. But of course, as very much an end-of-line part spin special if you will, this is not a machine that was built for any great length of time, and by 1963 production had ended after only a year. As a consequence, these machines are rare and desirable, but extremely capable, and it's easy to see why these bikes are so desirable. Want the performance, and above all the styling of the iconic Gold Star, but with easier starting and better road manners? That then is the RGS. What other bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us cover in a future video? Perhaps you've got a bike we can use for a test ride? Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.